Helping students become fluent, confident readers isn't always easy. It can feel frustrating for students if they are still sounding out words and struggling to make meaning. Building fluency in students is critical, and having a structure for teaching and practicing fluency is even more important.
That's where synchronous paired oral reading techniques, or SPORT, comes in. In today's episode, we're talking with Jake Downs, assistant professor at Utah State University and host of the Teaching Literacy podcast. Personally, it's one of our favorite podcasts. Jake will break down exactly how SPORT works, how you can start using it tomorrow, and what the research says about its impact on fluency, comprehension, and confidence. Hi, Jake. Welcome to the podcast. We're so happy you're here.
Hey, Melissa and Lori. Thanks for having me on the show. Glad to be here today.
Yeah, thank you. We've been on your podcast. Now you're on our podcast. We're so excited.
Lots of great stuff to talk about.
Yeah, and we're talking all about synchronous paired oral reading, or really fun acronym we get to use this whole time is SPORT. So for teachers who may not be familiar with this, can you just give everyone a quick overview of this synchronous paired oral reading? And the T is techniques, correct?
Yes, T techniques. Yeah.
T techniques.
So SPORT is pretty straightforward. It's a pairing between a higher achieving reader and a lower achieving reader. And this pair will synchronously, chorally read a text or a series of texts. And it can be the tutor, the lead reader can be a same age peer, can be a cross age peer, or can be an adult peer as well. More practically, what that means is there can be lots of different configurations that fit that definition. So this is something that can fit into your core instruction, your tier 1 reading time. It can fit into content area text when you use those. It can be supplemental reading that occurs during the day, or it can also be something a bit more structured with some adult tutoring or intervention that happens. And I'm sure we can get to each of those throughout the conversation.
Yeah, we'll dig
I would
into
love
them.
to.
Yep.
So it sounds really flexible. It sounds like a flexible technique, and I'm curious how you learned about it and what made you interested in studying it.
Yeah, the short version is when I was very first beginning my doctorate program, I was a fourth grade teacher by day, a PhD student by night, and there was a study on dyad reading, one specific type of sport that had just been published and had been done here at Utah State. And my principal there was a flyer that the state of Utah, USBE, had kind of done a little flyer kind of talking about the study and the results, and my principal had somehow gotten a hold of that, and Shelley Healy gave that to me and said, hey, I know you're starting a PhD, I know you're interested in reading research, you might be interested in this. And one of the authors on that study was Dr. Kit Moore, who just happened to be over the doc program and was sort of my initial advisor. And so I started talking with her about the study, and I was teaching fourth grade, so I was really caring about how do I help my students access grade level text, challenging text, how do I support my students who need support, and it just kind of evolved and blossomed from there. So I ended up we did a study that was published in 2020, and then I ended up doing my dissertation that looked at sort of a constellation of practices that have that paired oral reading between a higher achieving reader and a lower achieving reader, and that's now been published in a couple different places as well. There's a much longer version, but that's the brief version.
Let's just dive in. People want to know, what does this actually look like in their classroom? And you mentioned, you said dyad reading is one example. So I'm assuming what we're talking about here is not just one way to do this, right? But it's more of an umbrella, like the synchronized, I'm going to get it wrong again. Synchronous paired oral reading techniques. There's several of them, correct? So can you talk to us about what are all those different techniques, and what's the kind of the common denominator between them?
Yeah, so for the nerdy folks, the 4 sub-practices that when I went out into the literature and I tried to see, okay, what are the practices that use paired oral reading between a higher achieving reader and a lower achieving reader, those 4 practices were neurologic impress method, which was developed in the US in the 60s and has been in and out of the literature. Studies been done on and off, for the past 50-ish years. There's paired reading, which is the UK version, capital P, capital R on paired reading. It's a specific approach. Then there is dyad reading. Those 2 ones I just mentioned in the early days used a lot of adult tutoring Newer versions have started to be more flexible and use peer tutoring or adult tutoring. So one version that's just exclusively peer tutors has been called dyad reading. And then Dr. Chase Young, who you've all had on the podcast, I've had on my podcast, he had an innovation in the 2010s called Read to Impress, which was an adult tutor with a reader, and they would synchronously read the text, but then it's stacked in repeated reading, and so the student would go back and reread portions of it. And so from that broad literature, and in reading the past 60 years of research on this, there's different times that I think would be really practical for teachers to use it during the day. And these are all, to one degree or another, demonstrated in the literature, but it's something that is usable for core reading instruction time. And we can get into the nuts and bolts of what that can look like. But, also if I'm using content area text, so I'm using, I'm fifth grade, my seed standards, I'm looking at how energy moves through an ecosystem. If I have a text on that, I can use paired oral reading in my classroom to do that. It can also be supplemental reading during the day. Sometimes we just want to stack in more opportunity for students in connected text for longer periods of time to build stamina, to help get them engaged in text, help them find text they really enjoy. But it can also be used as intervention or an additional level support of if I have a student that is really needing some growth in reading fluency, so support in accuracy, support in ORF, myself as a teacher, or I might have a paraprofessional, or I might have a parent volunteer that I can train to go and do some of this with a student. So those are kind of the times that it might work, and we can get into brass tacks of what each of those look like, but thinking it's flexible also is like, well, I could use students within my classroom to be a lead reader, to be a tutor. I could use students in the next grade up, from the fourth grade teacher down the hall, the fifth grade teacher down the hall. I could pull some of those students, we find a common time, have them be lead readers, but it could also be adult tutors. And what I like in some of Chase Young's studies is, he's used the people at the front office, he's used the janitor. I mean, sort of any body within the school that is, that can read and that's viable as a tutor, he's pulled those adults in to help support some of these lowest achieving readers and being able to develop in their accuracy, their fluency, and comprehension.
Just a quick side note, at my son's school, they do like a PBIS type thing, where they earn bucks of some kind and then they turn those in to get something. And one of the prizes that is like the most popular is the fifth graders and the fourth graders get to go read to the kindergarten and first graders, and they love it. I mean, teachers love it because it doesn't cost any money to do anything, but it's also like the kids love reading to the younger kids. It's really, really cool.
That's such a great point, right? That is a win-win-win-win. For kindergarten and first grade kids, like the fourth and fifth grade students are just like the coolest. Like they are at the peak of what it means to be cool. But for whatever reason, like fourth and fifth graders, when they sometimes get a little, I've got a fifth grader at home, right? And he's starting to get a little too cool for some things. But I guarantee you, if his teacher said we're going to read to kindergartners, he'd be all in. Cost effective, right? It doesn't cost any money. It's a little bit of time, but we don't even need special books. Like, what books are we already using? Why reinvent the wheel? Like, let's just bake with the flour we've got and figure out effective ways to do things with the existing ingredients we've got.
Can we talk a little bit about what happens in those? I'm thinking as a teacher now, like, okay, I have my tutor and my tutee and they're reading together, but like, are there specific things that should be happening? Were they the same in all of those that you mentioned, or were they different?
Yeah, the basic ingredient here is that the lead reader and the assisted reader are choral reading the text out loud at the same time. Now there are some variations with that, but like, let's say, maybe let's take of kind of the different configurations, the times I mentioned. Let's just talk supplemental reading, because that's kind of I think the most simplest to talk about first. So let's say I want to I have my core reading time, I have intervention time, but I also have maybe a 15 or 20 minute slot that's like, sometimes you just get those weird gaps in your schedule where it's like, oh, I have computer lab on Monday and Wednesday. Well, what do I do on Tuesday and Thursday during that time? So that would be a great time to say, you know what, maybe I want some supplemental reading time for my students to be able to have time in texts that are engaging, but also be able to have extended time in text where we're not, sometimes during reading instruction, our instruction starts to sliver up the text into small chunks, which we do need. Like, instruction's a good thing. Like, we should be teaching texts and teaching them very well. But we also, I think, want to find times to complement that with more extended time in text where students can, work on things like stamina, be able to, quote unquote, like get into a text. So like a little half-hour gap or 20-minute gap a couple times in the week would be a great time for that. So if I had, let's say I had my class and we were doing something like that, I might divide my class up into half. I might divide my class up into thirds. And what it would be is the like if I just was dividing my class in half, that the students that were in the higher achieving half of the class, they would go and read connected text with the half of the class that was lower achieving. Now, as far as the text, there's a lot of there's flexibility in what you could choose. It can be 100% self-selected text, right? That the students are saying, hey, what book are you reading at home? And that can be the text that's read. The pair here, they are reading the same text out loud. Sometimes students have, at least in my experience, like when you go in, especially like your students who have the most room to grow, your students that are the lowest achieving in the class, if you take them to the library and you say, hey, go tear it up, that might be too much choice for them, right? That they might not, so sometimes it's easier for the teacher to say, okay, hey, what genres are you interested in? And maybe like as a teacher, curate a smaller selection of texts for students to choose from. But one important consideration here is right now there's a lot of conversation around grade level text. And there's a lot of conversation around how do we scaffold readers up rather than water our texts down. And I think teachers, and I think that's absolutely right. I mean, every metaphor breaks down at some point, but I tend to think of like text complexity, like strength training, right? Like if I'm only ever lifting the weights I'm already good at lifting, it's going to be really hard to get stronger. But if I'm systematically doing weights that stretch me, I am going to get stronger over time. And I think that's an analogy that Shanahan has used a couple times as well. But it doesn't have to be, I don't have to be super duper worried that the text that the student is reading aligns directly with their independent reading level because they have a scaffold. They have a lead reader that's going to be synchronously reading that text out loud at the same time. And so this is where some of the dyad reading studies are interesting because they've studied students that are 2, 3, or 4 grade levels above the independent reading level of the assisted reader, and they found that students actually do really well with that. And so if, let's say I'm a 3rd grade teacher, well, I probably have students that are reading at a 2nd grade level. I might have a few that are reading at a 1st grade level. A grade or 2 grade levels above is grade level text. And so we can give them the opportunity to select a text that they're going to enjoy, and then they can read that text synchronously out loud with a lead reader a couple times a week, 15 to 20 minutes. And the average effect across all of those, so that should yield, a decent effect over about 60 instructional days, following, 15 to 20 minutes a couple times a week.
That's so great. So I think the question that is in everyone's brain right now, Jake, is which students should be the tutees and which students should be the tutors? How do you figure that out? And then what does the teacher do while those kiddos are working together? Like there's the lead reader, which I guess I was calling which I just referred to as the tutor, right? And then there's not the lead reader, which would be like the quote tutee. But lead reader sounds much better, I think, when we're podcasting than trying to say, that's a hard word to say, podcasting.
I can type it, but I also have a 5th grader at home that I can't say tutee in my house anymore.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So tutor, lead reader, assisted reader.
There we go.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
We're all on the same page now. Take it away.
So yeah, those terms are synonymous there. So the question being, who should be tutored and like what would the selection process look like? Well, I think a good rule of thumb to follow is, okay, the students that need support are the ones that get it, and the students that need the most support get the most support. So looking at that, like if it were me, I would take oral reading fluency data. So something like a Dibbles 8, something like an Acadience. Those are quick 1-minute, indicators of basic fluency. And I would, and this is interesting where, so Matt Burns last year had a meta-analysis that I think really convincingly showed that let me reword that. So if it were me, this is where I diverge a little bit from the literature. A lot of the studies have done just like comprehension level and used that to match students. I think one of the studies Matt Burns had last year showed that it's probably actually going to be better to do that by probably accuracy or the ORF measure. So if it were me, I would take my oral reading fluency data from Dibbles 8, from Acadience, from something similar like that, and I would, like in my Google Sheet, in Excel, click on the first row, go to data, make a filter, and then I can sort highest to lowest really easily. So I would take either my accuracy column, maybe my ORF column, and sort that from highest to lowest, and then split that in the middle. So if I have 20 kids, the student ranked number 1 with accuracy would be reading with the student ranked number 11. 2 with 12, so on and so forth. So then 9, well, I guess actually 10 would then be reading with 20. One question I get asked is, well, what if like 5 and 15, aren't a good pairing? You don't have to, this isn't a perfect science. Like, it's not that the magic brew is that 5 has to be with 15. And so you absolutely can take in student considerations as well, how well the students get along or don't get along. The 2 students that should absolutely like not be working together at any point during the day as much as possible, right? Like, those don't have to be the partners. So there's the principle here is a lead reader and assisted reader, and that the lead reader has a higher achievement level than the assisted. So there's flexibility there.
Jake, I'm curious if you've ever done it where I'm looking at like student number 1 is actually paired with the lowest student.
20.
I have in my 20. I have in my head like you saying that make sure that the student that needs the most support gets the most support. And I'm like, well, would it be more beneficial for them to be with the highest reader in the class?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And this is where there's not studies in this area. So I'm going to speak to you from, this is just
Absolutely
Jake's classroom experience and observation and thoughts. What I've noticed when I've tinkered with this in the classroom is sometimes the gap between reader 1 and reader 20 is so big that sometimes the reader 1 is getting frustrated. They are serving as a tutor. We need to remember that. And so they are providing support. The benefit they're getting is just the benefit that they would receive from oral reading connected text. And so sometimes I've seen those readers actually get a little bit more frustrated when there's that big of a difference.
It's a good point.
So when I think about, okay, the students needing the most support get the most support, that's where I start to think, is there a parent volunteer? Can I beg or borrow paraprofessional time for 15 or 20 minutes?
Right. Or Lori asked, what does the teacher do during this time?
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
It could be.
Or absolutely, the teacher, okay, I can obviously be circulating and providing support, but I might be able to then, okay, I'm going to work with the lowest student, or maybe I pull like the lowest 2 or 3 and we're doing it as a group. I don't think there's anything that would prohibit that from being effective as well. And you might have like just that star student at the top of the class that just is mature for their age, that can handle doing something like that. And that would be viable. But what the data show is an adult tutor has a higher effect than a peer tutor, which makes complete sense. But within a classroom context, there's a lot more peer tutors available than there are adult tutors. And so it's thinking flexibly of, if I have adult support, I'm going to give that to the students that need it the most, and then sort of triage from there.
Jake, is there anything you want to say more about the benefit to the student who is the lead reader, who's doing the tutoring work? I think that's a question that, like, I'm just thinking as a parent. If I was a teacher listening, I'd be like, what if this parent comes in and says like, well, my kid's being a tutor for this other kid 40 minutes a week, right? Like, let's just pretend there's 2 20-minute sessions. I would want to be able to articulate the benefit. Obviously, it's practice reading, right? And oral reading. Are there any specific benefits that we can call out?
Yeah, and this is where, when we're thinking about peer tutors, there's most of the studies measure the outcomes of the assisted reader. There's only a handful that measure any outcome from the lead reader, and there's only one that actually, and those have like compared lead readers compared to everyone else, like just compared to a general control group. There's only one study that specifically compared outcomes of lead readers that were doing dyad reading in this case versus students in the control group that were also in the top half of their class achievement-wise. And what that study found was the benefit was they didn't have any added benefit, but they also didn't suffer either, that their outcomes were not lower. So the benefit they get is they're reading connected text for 20 minutes. And so that's when you might want to also think about, and I think that's a valid concern. Like, if I'm a parent, I might not want my, my student to be a tutor for 40 minutes during the week. We kind of have to think, we have to use that resource wisely in remembering that these lead readers, they are basically serving in a tutoring role. So that means I need to find other things during the day that is going to more directly support their needs. But also it can be, maybe, okay, let's say I'm doing a science text, right? Like, let's go back to that, how energy moves through an ecosystem text. Maybe I'm not doing the dyad reading with my whole class, that's a sport with my whole class. Maybe it's just the lowest achieving readers, like the bottom, third, or the students that really need access to that text. And then there's a pool. I've trained maybe most of my class how to be lead readers. And so then like that can rotate then. So it's like, hey, sometimes your buddy reader is this person for a week, and then we change and it's this person for a week. And so then it's not this like heavy concentrated dose. It's like a sprinkling of, oh, hey, here and there when we're reading text throughout the day, some of the students, they read the text with, with other students in the class. And so then it's not too much of a burden on those highest achieving readers. And there is one study that did that in the late 80s, where they were basically any time that students were reading during the day, students that were not at the grade level expectation for reading, that were still striving readers, they read that text with a lead reader that was at grade level expectation, and they rotated tutors fairly frequently. So it wasn't necessarily like, here's our set aside time. It just was, when we're reading text, we're going to pull in a lead reader to assist you with it, and we're going to rotate tutors so that way it's never too much of a time burden, that we're not sapping too much instructional time away from those readers to support our lowest readers.
Yeah, well, and I think that's such a good point. I love the idea of being flexible with your students, right? With their pairing of the students. I also was thinking, Jake, while you were talking, you mentioned the benefit of the connected text. It could be that they're also getting that benefit of the connected text and that practice with new vocabulary, right? That they haven't, like, I'm just thinking, like, very practically as the teacher, I'd be pulling out some of like the very practical things. Like, if we're learning about energy, then I'm going to make sure we're going to have like really tough vocabulary in there that could be conquered on this read, because we know that the texts can be more challenging, like you said.
Yeah, and that's like, and this is a time where either A, we can use like whatever text we're already using, we can use those as a way to effectively consume the text. But, B, if we do want to add supplemental text, or they can and should be really engaging text. Or like to your point, okay, if I'm doing, like, if I do want to pick some really challenging technical vocabulary, then maybe before we read the text, I'm going to do a brief multisyllabic routine. Let's peel off what prefixes do we see, what suffixes, let's underline the vowels. Okay, let's scoop blend this. So here's how I read this word accurately. Here's what this word means now, a word like photosynthesis. Okay, now let's split up and read the text. Okay, now we're going to come back after. We'll split up and read the text using sport. Let's come back and talk about it. It can really sort of naturally weave into other things that we're going to do to support word reading accuracy, to support vocabulary, to support comprehension as well.
Such a good point. Yeah, I love that. And then it's not something that's like, oh, the separate tutoring thing that we're doing. We're not. We're doing sport as part of an integrated approach to teaching reading and writing.
Yeah. And that's a really good point, that sometimes, like, to do a good study, it has to be very, I don't know, isolate isn't the right term, but you're trying to control for a lot of variables. And so, like, in a lot of the studies that are in this literature, they've sort of set up the tutoring thing as its own separate chunk during the day, which it totally can be. But the principle here being a lead reader, an assisted reader, choral reading text out, choral reading text synchronously, like, it can and it should be a technique, and one among many. I don't want to oversell it. It's just one technique among many that we can embed into our instruction to have text be engaging, to make sure that we're helping students access grade level text more efficiently.
That's really helpful. All right, the only reason why I'm pausing is because I feel like we already did talk about this question a little bit. How do we want to approach it? I'm not even
sure where are we at in the outline.
Do we want to talk about the texts a little more?
I feel like we've already hit on the text and the time.
What about,
good.
What if you ask about, so like we've sort of covered what it could look like in content. we've sort of covered what it can look like supplemental. So maybe say, ask like, okay, so what about during core reading time? Are there any thoughts about how it could be done there?
This is actually so great. I love actually podcasting with someone who's a podcaster. You're like, thank you for just telling me what
ask
to do.
This.
All right,
or
Melissa,
did you still want to ask about the time, or are we good to jump?
Oh, sorry, I didn't even see that one.
It's okay.
I feel like we talked
kind
about
of
that,
touched
right?
on that too. That's what I was thinking.
Well, while we're breaking, let me just
cough it out.
A cough and we're good. Yeah, I'm back.
I feel like if it would just be like a straightforward answer. So we've already talked about it, so I'm fine.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
All right. So we've talked a lot about texts, Jake, but I've heard you say things like these should be challenging texts at grade level, maybe even above grade level, not at a student's independent level. And these connected texts, so making sure we would love for them to be connected to topics they're learning about, reading about. I'm wondering about in like the core ELA instruction time. Could this fit in there as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think right now, along with the conversation on grade level text, there's a lot of conversation on core reading programs. I know in Utah, our science reading legislation has required a lot of schools and districts to look at their core reading program and update and adopt new core reading programs. And I think as I talk with other folks, that seems to be something that's happening in a lot of states here in the US. And so part of when I'm doing stuff with my core reading program is, this can still be done and integrated with that. And this is actually where my thinking started to get a lot more flexible with this. There was a couple studies, again, from the late 80s that were actually done here in Utah, a little bit further south from me at Brigham Young University, that helped me started to think about how it could be done flexibly during, they called it basal time, but we'd probably say, core reading time or tier 1 time or whatever that lingo is for when we're together reading, doing text stuff as a class. So they had an interesting approach, and I alluded to this earlier, but Eldridge College actually divided the class up into thirds. So rather than half and half, they divided the class into thirds. So what you had was the highest achieving group, that top third. They would just read the text in partners, and then the teacher would have some, like a graphic organizer, a little bit of extension work. Then the middle third and the bottom third, they did the choral reading of the text together. So it would be, okay, we're in Module 4, Unit 1, here's our text we're reading. That's how they would consume the text. And then they would come back and the teacher would do whatever the instruction was going to be while they were reading the text. The students would actually just read straight through it and then come back and the teacher would do the instructional points afterward. And I think that sort of solves or mitigates at least a little bit, sometimes, especially when in the upper grades, like a 4th or 5th grade, your highest achieving readers in a lot of cases, they can fly. And so sometimes they get a little bit frustrated, or perhaps it's more adaptive, it's more responsive if highest achieving are working together, and then the middle group that could still use some benefit, that the extended oral reading practice is going to have more benefit for them, they're serving as lead readers for the lowest third, and so that's perhaps a more productive way. So they kind of did triad, like split it into thirds that way, but it doesn't have to be, whatever normal text I'm doing during my core reading program time, I need to have a lot of tools in my tool belt. If there's one of me and 20 of them, to say, how are we going to read this text? How are we going to consume this text in a productive way? And how am I going to make sure that my students who struggle the most to access grade level text, how do I involve them in this text in a way that is also simultaneously promoting their reading accuracy, their reading fluency, and also their reading comprehension? So that's one approach, but you could also split your class up into halves as well. That would work just fine also, but I think that one example of splitting as thirds is an interesting way to think about it.
Yeah, and this reminds me of, I'm going to do a real throwback, Lori, get ready. Our very first episode 6 years ago was about, fidelity to a curriculum. And this is kind of what we talked about with that, there should be some flexibility, because, that core program might say something like, just have students read the text. It might not even specify if they should be reading with partners, or it doesn't specify the how, right? It might just say read pages X to Z, right? this is the perfect time for the teacher to bring in this kind of technique and go, okay, they are going to read those pages. How they do it, I'm going to bring this research-based technique in to support my students the way they need it.
I'm a curriculum person. I like curriculum. I think curriculum is productive. I think curriculum gives a good framework for teachers, but I kind of go with the Goldilocks rule here that, looking at especially some of these like really big publishers that, just mass producing the curriculum for millions of students. My classroom here in northern Utah, we're practically Idaho, the specific reading needs accuracy, fluency, comprehension, but also like linguistic or cultural, like the type of text that's going to be responsive to them is going to vary different than, all of you there on the East Coast. So there is room to, this is where, for me, too hot is that I'm just going to do exactly what the curriculum says and check. I checked all my boxes, because then I've removed responsibility for myself out of the equation. It's now check. I did what the curriculum says, whatever happens, happens. But too cold for me is like, okay, I'm just going to like throw out the curriculum and do whatever I want, because then that's a lot of time and prep. And I'd rather have basic ingredients and then me decide how to spend my time on crafting the instruction, on implementing the instruction, rather than just sort of creating stuff from scratch. That's my sort of middle ground of not too hot, not too cold, but just right. And where a teacher can bring their knowledge, their expertise, their pedagogical knowledge, their science of reading knowledge to be able to make that curriculum, like transform it into something better than what it is as written.
Okay, so we didn't prepare you for this question, Jake, but I'm wondering, have you talked with any kids who have used the sport routine, or is there any or the technique, or is there any notes anecdotally in the research from the kids, like what they said about it?
This is great. I love an impromptu question like this. So I can first speak to when I was doing this in my classroom as a doc student. There was a couple students that I talked with parents, and parents brought the kids to school early, and I said, hey, of anyone in my classroom, who would you want to read with twice a week? And this, of course, he picked his best buddy, right? And this student needed a lot of support. He was just sort of classic symptoms, or not symptoms, but classic data set that to me said dyslexia, right? So they would come and they would read before school twice a week, and I tried to make it like as cozy as possible. So it's like, oh, you get my softest chairs, right? And you can be right here next to my desk while I'm prepping things. And occasionally it's like, here's a granola bar, here's a fruit snack. It doesn't take a lot, but they had a lot of fun with it. But it also, he did experience good growth. So, and I have a couple other kind of smaller experiences like that. But there are a few studies that, and this again comes more so from the dyad reading literature, which your listeners probably not care about the nuances of the different literatures here, but there was one study where they just sort of asked open-ended like student responses about it. And then there was another study where they kind of did a more structured response with attitudes. And the students, by and large, the assisted readers enjoyed it. Now, some of the tutors, right, especially on the attitudes survey, that one they did kind of show that they didn't love it, but in this study they were dyad reading every day for 20 minutes for 90 days, so it's
Wow.
Yeah, like over half a year there is definitely potential for burnout. But on the one hand, from my experience and sort of triangulating with that with the 2018 study, that I just have this crazy belief that students actually really enjoy it when they're in really good text and when they can access that text really well. And so I'm thinking of one of my readers that she was a striving reader in 4th grade, so she was below benchmark on accuracy and comprehension. She was also a multilingual learner. Her family had migrated from northern Mexico, so she'd been in the U.S. for probably 3 or 4 years. So most of she's probably in kindergarten, I think, when they'd moved here. But she was very hesitant to participate in class. I had to structure a lot of that to make sure she was getting lots of oral language experience. She was reading a book on it was some sort of horse book. That's all I remember, and I don't. Horse is a genre I don't do in books or in movies. They're just too sad. But she really loved this book. But she was able to, and I know this is kind of like a corny, but there's no way she would have been able to read that book independently by herself. But bringing in an adult tutor to read with her twice a week for 20 minutes, and it was just a parent in my class that I said, hey, I need some volunteers who will volunteer. She was able to read a book that she would never be able to access otherwise. So I think there's room there for more like empirical research on engagement, on sort of their attitudes, on their experience. But you bundle that together, that they're reading a text more challenging than they'd be able to read otherwise. The text is probably more interesting than, if I'm a fourth grade reader, but I can only read first grade text, there's a point where Magic Treehouse starts to not really pull my attention anymore. But I'm also, okay, so the syntactic complexity, the range of vocabulary, I mean, all of that sort of stacks together to say, you know what, this I think it really is a viable, one practice among many, but a way to think about how do we get kids into grade level text, into more challenging text, but thinking of more challenging text as generally being, there's a lot more interesting stuff happening in grade level text than below grade levels text.
So are there any challenges to this? I feel like I want to talk a little bit about that because I think that you mentioned some, right? Like the partnership adjustments. You mentioned that earlier, and how to kind of navigate that. But are there any other challenges that teachers should consider when they're thinking about implementing sport?
Yeah, so we've definitely talked about, there's, adjust partnerships as needed, right? There's not a hard and fast rule here. We have also addressed a little bit that the peer burnout on the lead reader side, that's something to watch for as well. And I think the way to avoid that is, one, okay, can I find a way to rotate tutors or adjust tutors? So as a teacher, the easiest thing for me is going to be to split my class in half. Everyone's reading, everyone's engaged. I can sit back and drink a Diet Coke. But that might not be best for like my students. And so maybe thinking about splitting things up into thirds, maybe thinking about, maybe it's just the lowest quarter of my students that are going to get sort of a lot of support, which gives me 3/4 of my students, or maybe the top 2/3 of my students, or half my students that can sort of rotate in and out of tutors. I also think it can be maybe it's today I'm using it as a way to read our core reading text. Tomorrow I'm using it to do our science text on how energy moves through an ecosystem. And then Thursday, hey, I've got some funny giggle poetry. I like Chase Young's all over giggle poetry. Like, here, I've curated, 5 or 10 giggle poetry poems. We have that weird 20-minute chunk where we're not doing computer lab. Let's do that on Thursday. Like, it can also like sort of be flexible with the different. So I think always shaking it up is one way to sort of avoid that burnout. The other one is just thinking a little bit about text complexity, grade level text, challenging text. And when I was talking about this once with a group of teachers, and I was talking about how there's just a small handful of studies that have done students in text 2 or 3 or 4 grade levels above their independent reading level, and the teacher's like, I can't even get my kids to like read grade level text, and now you're saying I have to read above grade level text? And that's a fair point. But I think the way I'd respond to that is saying, well, that's a nuance of how it was conducted in a research study, to see how much stretch is too much stretch. Is stretch a viable way to promote accuracy and fluency? And so it doesn't have to be that when you're using it in your classroom. I mean, you could curate bins. That's a popular way of, okay, here's a bin. Purple is this lexile to this lexile. Red bin's this lexile to this lexile. And you have kids read, 2 or 3 grade levels above their independent reading. Like, that's one way to do it. But again, going back to, if I'm a 4th grade teacher, probably some of my struggling students are striving students. They're at a 2nd grade level. So 2 grade levels above would be grade level text. So I don't think text curation is always a rabbit hole we can go down as a teacher. And it's something that I'd rather streamline the text curation process, which is going to free up time for me to think about the implementation, like teaching that text. So I would say, just start with what texts are you already using? Because if those are grade level texts, grade level's challenging enough in the era of Common Core. Let's just start there. What are texts that are already achieving our content learning objectives, our ELA objectives? What are the texts we're already using, and start there? But if we're doing supplemental stuff or other stuff during the day, we don't have to get super ticky-tacky about, like, it has to be exactly 2 grade levels. It's just, Is there a text the students enjoy that's also going to give them challenge when we're talking supplemental reading? I think is, I mean, there's going to be variation, but I think that's good enough in the ballpark to at least start with for a classroom teacher pragmatically.
Jake, I'm also thinking one of the challenges that could definitely happen would be more of like a management situation. And I'm wondering if you have any tips for training or, how do you get students ready to do this before they do? Especially I'm thinking of those lead readers. Like, how do they know what their role is?
Yeah, though, so
Cut that out.
got so close without my coughing fit. All right. But it was just at the beginning. I wasn't too far into it. That's such a great question, and I'm glad you asked that, because that is part of this that I haven't addressed yet. So however I'm doing it, so let's say that I've got 3 parent volunteers that are coming in twice a week. I need to train those volunteers. It doesn't take long. This isn't rocket science. But there is a structured protocol here, right? You are orally reading the text with the student out loud for 15 to 20 minutes, and maybe coaching them to say, if it's an adult, this generally I think works a little bit better with adult tutors. Okay, twice during that session, you're going to pause and let the students reread a chunk of that text. It can be a paragraph, and then over time, maybe build up to a half page or a whole page. And so it's adding in some repeated reading, so the student is reading part of that text independently. It's kind of alternating between choral reading, but then also an independent read, but it's of stuff that's already been read out loud. And you just model that for them. So it really can be just take one session, and instead of doing the thing, just train your adult tutors how to do it, just model how to do it. And like when I would do it, I'd just get out a text with one of the parents, and I would just show exactly what it looks like. And that's generally enough to make it work. And you could also, there's lots like multisyllabic, vocabulary. That easily can stack in other evidence-based things as well for what a volunteer would be capable of doing. Now, when I'm with my students, I just keep it very, I do train them, right? So whoever are going to be my lead readers, I would say, hey, well, sometimes in class we're gonna do sport. I have whatever, or whatever kind of fancy nickname I want to call it, and I just would explain them really plainly how to do it. And I'm probably not getting into like, oh well, you're the higher achieving group. I just keep this is what we're doing, and this is going to be great for everyone. And I just kind of frame it as that. And again, I would have just a quarter sheet that says, eyes on text, reading out loud at the same time. It just sort of has my classroom protocol. And then I would model it with a student, and then I'd have them just pair up for 2 minutes to practice it. And then they would keep that sort of that laminated square cutout that they can keep, and then they just do that whenever they're being lead reader. And then I'd also talk with the assisted readers, or I'd talk with the group as a whole and just say, hey, we're going to do this sometimes. It's just really important because it's going to help. Reading text can be hard, and so this is a way that we can all be engaged and able to understand and access the text that we're reading, and then just kind of go over the simple protocol. So it doesn't take a lot, but that is an agreement that has to be there. And then so like most things, right? Like a clear protocol, a clear structure, model it to sort of get it going. And then that is a thread you have to pull. So every couple of weeks, it's like, hey, just a reminder, here's what I'm seeing, all the classroom management stuff. But hey, just a reminder, this is what it looks like. This is what it should sound like. And to just to keep the expectation there. So just so that time can be used really productively, right? We want every instructional minute to be maximized in its potential.
Yeah. So speaking of that potential, I think you've mentioned a few times about the benefits, but I'm curious, let's get a little bit nerdy here with the research. You looked at all the research on this technique, give some teachers the why they should do this. What have you seen in the research that would make me want to do this in my classroom?
Yeah, so this, our conversation is really stemming from my recording paused. Are we back?
Sorry.
All right, we're good.
That was
Okay.
Just meant to mute.
I thought I did it.
So our conversation stemming from my dissertation research. So I looked at every study that's had that exact protocol: higher achieving reader, lower achieving reader, synchronously reading connected text. And I pulled studies I did a comprehensive review, so it was all the way back to the 60s. Long story short, so what I found across that is there's medium to large effects in fluency and comprehension. And that's with that average dose of, 15 to 20 minutes, probably 3 to 4 times a week. That should be enough to yield those medium to large effects over the course of 12 weeks. Now, they were both above, if you follow like Hattie's cutoffs for effect sizes, they were both above zero point 0.4. If you follow like Cohen's cutoffs for effect size, they were medium to large. But what was interesting to me was that the comprehension effects were actually larger than the fluency effects, which struck me as interesting because choral reading text together, that's more of a fluency, print exposure, reading volume. There's not a lot of like teaching comprehension things happening there. So that is an interest, and there's a couple reasons why that might be the case. Well, it could be the case that students are accessing text that they wouldn't be able to otherwise. So they're being introduced to more sophisticated vocabulary, sophisticated language, knowledge structures, etc., that is benefiting their comprehension, which is like great. Like that's wonderful. But it could also be and I don't want to get too nerdy here, but a lot of the effects on the fluency side were, especially the older studies, were accuracy percentage in connected text. Well, accuracy has a ceiling of 100. So if a student started a study with 96%, they only have 4% to grow, which makes it hard to you can't have a super large effect when you only have 4 to go. But there is research indicating that it does support the fluency as well. And that's primarily how it's talked about in the literature, is comprehension and fluency. I think there is also this print exposure, reading stamina flair to it. And I briefly addressed this earlier, but we're always I believe in teaching, I believe in instruction. So we should be teaching our readers. But a lot of times I notice in tier 1 instruction, the actual reading students do sort of get slivered and diced up among the instructional things that are happening. And part of, I think, developing really strong literate readers means that we want to have readers that can persevere through text, that can read text for longer than a minute. We've all had the experience where we're reading with a student and especially I think of when I was progress monitoring a student on an ORF passage, and they start out so strong for the first 10 seconds, and even by the 60-second mark, they've just wilted, right? So we do want to build up their automaticity so that they can process text with low cognitive bandwidth, because, well, one, that's going to free up more bandwidth for comprehension, but two, we want to be able to help them sustain being able to read text for an extended period of time, for 15, 20 minutes. So I think there is an aspect there that if we're just reading text for 20 straight minutes in a structured way, I think there's benefits there that's hard to quantify, but especially when I think of striving readers, that's something they're probably not getting at other chunks during the day, and I think that's that's something really good that we can scaffold for them as well.
Jake, this is awesome. Is there anything else? Is there anything we've missed? Anything you want to leave our listeners with before we sign off today about sport?
I can share with you all, if folks want to go and get into the stuff I've written on it, I can leave you all a link to a Google Drive folder or something where I have a link tree link that folks can go and read more, read more about it. I would just emphasize that this isn't a silver bullet, right? This is one approach among many. This is one tool in a very big tool belt, but I think it is a viable way to help say, any text I want to consume any text we're reading during the day, I want to be able to consume that productively. Because if I consume it productively, if I read it in a fluent way, then that means there's more stuff there to comprehend because the student collected more things in the text along the way, if that makes sense. And so whether it's this method or other methods, that the text we consume is so important that there's no the texts we use should matter. They should be texts that are content area, informational texts, no junk texts. And we're always thinking, how do we use these texts wisely, especially for striving readers that are still working to reach grade level accuracy, fluency, comprehension expectations. I think that would be my final word on how this fits into broader instructional things.
No junk texts. I think we should make a t-shirt.
Yeah, let's do it. Let's do t-shirt, coffee mugs. We'll do it all. Stickers.
Well, thank you so much. This is great. I know I can't wait to try this. So thank you so much for all your good work and for talking about it with us.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks for the work that you all do.